He looked me dead in the eye 3 months into knowing me and said, "I picked you because you were the only one who showed up." And I laughed like it was nothing, because I didn't know yet that those words would end up being the truest, kindest thing anyone had ever said to me. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 29 years old, and if you'd met me back then, you would have called me careful. Not shy, not weak, just careful. The way a person gets when they've spent years walking through a house full of furniture that might tip over if they bump it wrong. I worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Dayton, the kind of job where you learn to read contracts for the sentence that's hiding the trap. I was good at my job. I was good at almost everything except knowing when I was the one being trapped. I want to tell you about the ordinary version of my life first, because you need to understand what I was walking away from before you understand what I was walking toward. I got up every morning at 5:45. I made coffee for 2, even on the mornings Derek didn't want any, because not making it felt like starting a fight before either of us had brushed our teeth. I ironed his shirts, because he said the dry cleaner ruined the collars. Though I never once saw evidence of ruined collars, just evidence that he liked watching me stand at an ironing board at 6 in the morning while he scrolled his phone at the kitchen table. I answered his texts within 10 minutes. If it took 11, my phone would buzz again and again until I answered, and I told myself that was love. I told myself a lot of things were love. We'd been engaged for 14 months. The ring was beautiful, a low, tasteful oval that had cost more than my car. And I used to catch myself staring at it on the drive home from work, turning my hand under the visor light, trying to remember what it had felt like the night he proposed, trying to feel that feeling again, because more and more it felt like I was wearing a leash that happened to sparkle. The trigger, if you want to call it that, wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I was scrolling a local classifieds app during my lunch break, hiding in my car in the parking garage because eating alone in the break room made Derek's sister ask questions I didn't want to answer, and I saw a posting that made me stop chewing. Wanted. Driving companion for cross-country relocation. Ohio to Oregon, 2 weeks. All expenses paid, modest stipend. Must be reliable, must not mind long silences or antique furniture. Serious inquiries only. I don't know why I clicked it. Maybe because must not mind long silences sounded like the opposite of every conversation I'd had in 14 months, where silence was treated like an accusation. I read it 4 times. I looked at the little thumbnail photo, a man standing next to a truck loaded with what looked like a roll-top desk wrapped in blankets, his face turned slightly away from the camera. I didn't apply. Not that day. I just saved it. The way you save a photo of a beach you'll probably never visit. And I went back upstairs and answered 11 texts from Derek, asking why I hadn't responded in 12 minutes. That night he found the ironing wrinkled on one collar. One collar on one shirt he wasn't even wearing that week. And he didn't yell. He never yelled. That was the thing people didn't understand when I tried, much later, to explain it to someone. He just went quiet in that specific way, set the shirt down very precisely on the counter, and said, "I don't know why I even bother explaining what I need." And then he didn't speak to me for the rest of the night, and I lay in bed with my chest so tight I had to consciously remind myself to breathe, running through every version of an apology I could give him in the morning, even though I still didn't fully understand what I'd done wrong. There were smaller moments too, the kind that don't sound like much when you say them out loud, which is exactly why they work. There was the time I got a small promotion at the firm, moved from filing to actual case prep, and I came home so proud I could barely get my key in the door. And Derek listened to the whole story with his arms crossed, and then said, "That's great, but did you remember to call the plumber about the sink? Because I asked you Monday." I remember standing in the kitchen with my excitement curdling in my stomach, apologizing for forgetting the plumber, forgetting entirely to ask him to be happy for me, because somewhere along the way I had learned that asking for that was its own kind of provocation. There was the time I wanted to go visit my mother for her birthday, 3 hours away, just for the day, and he said, "Of course, go. Have fun," and then didn't speak to me for 2 days after I got back, not because I'd done anything, just because I'd gone somewhere without him, and he needed me to feel the cost of that before he'd let it go. There was the time I cried in the shower so he wouldn't hear, because crying where he could hear meant a conversation about why I was choosing to be upset, as if sadness were a decision I was making at him rather than something happening inside me. I want to be clear that none of this looked dramatic from the outside. My co-workers thought Derek was polite, a little quiet, the kind of boyfriend who showed up to the holiday party in a nice sweater and remembered everyone's names. My own mother liked him. That's the part nobody warns you about. How ordinary it looks from a doorway. How much it looks like patience and providing and steadiness right up until you're the one standing inside it at 2 in the morning, trying to remember what you did wrong this time. That was the first crack. Or maybe it wasn't the first. Maybe it was just the first one I let myself notice. I lay there with my hand pressed flat against my sternum, like I could hold myself together with my own palm. And somewhere under the fear there was a small, sharp, treacherous thought. I could just not be here. I didn't act on it for another 11 days, but I kept the tab open on my phone. I read the posting so many times I could have recited it. And on a Thursday, sitting in the parking garage again, hands shaking so hard I typed my own name wrong twice, I wrote back. Hi. I saw your listing. I'm reliable, I don't mind quiet, and I have 2 weeks I could take off work. Can you tell me more about the job? The reply came 4 hours later, while I was standing at the ironing board, phone buzzing silently in my back pocket because I'd learned to keep it on silent and check it in bathroom breaks, a small rebellion nobody could see. Thanks for writing. Not much more to tell. I restore antique furniture. I'm moving my shop from Dayton to a town outside Eugene, and I need someone to help me drive one of the trucks and keep me awake on the long stretches. Pay is $1,800 for the 2 weeks plus all expenses. I should be upfront that I've had the listing up for 3 weeks, and you're the first person who's actually written back. Everyone else either ghosted after 1 message or wanted way more money than I can offer. If you're serious, I'd like to meet in person before we commit to anything. No pressure either way. I read that message maybe 20 times over the next 2 days, but the part that snagged in my chest wasn't the money or the job. It was you're the first person who's actually written back. Nobody had wanted him. Nobody had shown up. There was something in that small, plain admission that felt like it recognized me, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. We met at a diner off Route 4, a squat little building with a pie case by the register and a waitress named Donna, who I would come to know very well in the following weeks. I got there first and sat in a booth with my back to the wall, because Derek had a habit of appearing in places he wasn't invited, and some old animal part of my brain needed to see the door. He came in 12 minutes late, apologizing before he'd even reached the table, saying something about a client who wouldn't stop talking about a Chippendale chair that probably wasn't even a real Chippendale. He was taller than his photo, broader through the shoulders, with sawdust ground into the creases of his knuckles like it had been there so long it had become part of his skin. His name was Sam Calloway, 33. He had a voice that stayed level even when he was clearly nervous, which I noticed because I was so unused to a man's voice staying level around me at all. So, he said, sliding into the booth across from me, rubbing the back of his neck, I have to be honest, I've never actually done this. Hired a stranger off the internet, I mean. My sister thinks I'm either going to get robbed or fall in love, and honestly at this point I'd take either outcome over driving 2,200 miles alone with a U-Haul full of my dead grandfather's furniture. I laughed before I could stop myself, a real laugh, surprised out of me, and something in my chest loosened half an inch. I promise I'm not going to rob you, I said. Falling in love with a U-Haul full of furniture. I can't make any promises. He smiled at that, a real one, crooked on one side, and for a second I forgot to check the door. We talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about his grandfather, who taught him to restore furniture in a garage in Cincinnati, patient and exacting, a man who believed you could tell everything about a person by how they treated something broken. He told me the shop in Ohio wasn't doing well, that rent had doubled, that a cousin had offered him a building outside Eugene for almost nothing if he'd come help run a family property, and that he was terrified of the drive not because of bandits or breakdowns, but because he'd be alone with his own head for 2,000 miles and he wasn't sure what he'd find there. I didn't tell him about Derek. Not that day. But I told him more true things about myself in those 2 hours than I'd told anyone in over a year, and every one of them came out easier than I expected, like a door that had been painted shut finally giving way. Near the end, when Donna came by with the check and he insisted on paying, he looked down at the table for a second too long. And then he said the thing that would end up meaning so much more later than it did in that moment. "I should tell you," he said. "You're not just the first person who wrote back. You're the only person who wrote back. I posted that thing in 3 different places for almost a month. I chose you because no one else applied. I don't want you to find that out later and feel like a consolation prize, because you're not, I promise. I'd rather be honest with you now than have you feel lied to on day 9 of a road trip." I looked at him for a long moment. My throat felt tight, and not in the way it went tight with Derek, not fear tight, something closer to being seen. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. "Most people would have let me think I was special." "You might turn out to be," he said, and then looked immediately embarrassed, like the sentence had gotten away from him. "I mean, I don't know you yet. That's not... I just meant..." "I know what you meant," I said, and I meant that too. Before we left the diner, Donna came by one more time to refill our coffee, and she looked between the two of us with the particular knowing look of a woman who has watched 1,000 first dates and first anything else's across that same laminate table, and she said, "You two want the pie? On the house, you look like you could use something sweet." And Sam laughed and said we hadn't even decided on the trip yet, and Donna said, "Oh, you've decided," and walked off before either of us could argue with her. We split a slice of coconut cream pie neither of us had ordered, and somewhere between bites he asked me, almost carefully, like he was testing whether the question was allowed, "Can I ask what you're driving away from? You don't have to answer. I just noticed you sat facing the door." I felt my whole body go still, caught. Nobody had ever noticed that about me before, not in 3 years, not once. "I like to see who's coming in," I said, which was true and also nothing. A door left open just a crack. "Fair enough," he said, and didn't push, and let it go so easily that I found myself wanting, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to be the one to push it back open myself. We shook hands outside the diner, his palm rough and warm, mine trembling slightly in a way I hoped he didn't notice, and he said, "Think about it. No pressure. But if you say yes, we leave Saturday at 6. "I'll let you know by Friday," I said, though some reckless, hopeful part of me had already decided. I want to pause here and tell you what happened when I got home that night, because the ordinary cruelty is important. It's the water I was swimming in, and you should understand it before I tell you about leaving it. Derek was on the couch when I came in, and he didn't ask where I'd been, not directly. He asked, "Good day?" in a tone that meant he already knew the answer wasn't going to be good enough, and when I said I'd met a friend for coffee, he said, "Must be nice, having time for friends," and went back to his show. I stood in the doorway with my keys still in my hand, and felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I applied for 2 personal days that Friday. I told the firm it was a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie, if you think about it the right way. I told Derek I was going to visit my cousin in Columbus for the weekend to help her move, which was a lie, a clean, deliberate one, the first real lie I had told him in 3 years, and my hands shook so badly typing the text that I had to redo it twice. Sam picked me up at 6 in the morning from a gas station 2 miles from my apartment. Not my apartment itself, because some instinct I couldn't yet name told me not to let anyone know exactly where I'd be standing. He had 2 trucks, a friend of his named Priya, driving the second one loaded with the heavier pieces. And when I climbed into the passenger seat of his truck with 1 duffel bag, and my heart going so hard I could feel it in my ears, he looked over at me and said, "You okay? You look like you're about to be sick." "I'm fine," I said, which was the second lie of the week, and the sun wasn't even up yet. We didn't talk much that first hour. I watched Ohio go flat and gray outside the window, watched the gas station shrink in the side mirror, and somewhere around mile 40 I started to cry quietly, trying to keep it from him. Wiping my face with the back of my wrist like that would make it invisible. He noticed anyway. Of course he noticed. But he didn't push. He just reached over, without looking at me, and turned the radio down a notch, like he was giving the moment more room. And after another few miles, he said very evenly, "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me. But if something's chasing you, I'd rather know now than get surprised by it in Nebraska." That was the evidence phase for me, in a way. Not documents, not screenshots, just the slow unspooling of my own story out loud, maybe for the first time in its entirety, over the next 400 miles. I told him about the ironing, the 11-minute rule, the silences that lasted for days, the way Derek would apologize for things that weren't apologies at all, more like recalibrations, reminders of where the line was. I told him about the time Derek had accidentally deleted 3 days of a work project I'd been up until 2 a.m. finishing, and how he'd stood in the doorway of my home office while I cried over it, arms crossed, saying, "I don't see why you're this upset. It's just a document," in a voice so calm it made me feel insane for shaking. Sam didn't say much while I talked. He kept his eyes on the road, both hands steady on the wheel, and every so often his jaw would tighten, just slightly, the only sign that any of it was landing on him at all. When I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for almost a full minute, and I started to panic that I'd said too much, that I'd scared him off, that this was the moment he'd start treating me like a problem instead of a person. Then he said, "My grandfather used to say you can tell a man's whole character by watching how he treats something that can't fight back. Furniture, dogs, people who love him too much to leave." He glanced at me just once, quick. "I'm sorry someone did that to you. And I'm sorry it took you this long to have someone say that to you plainly." I put my hand over my mouth and cried again, harder this time, but it felt different than the crying in the ironing kitchen. It felt like something draining out of a wound instead of something being pressed further in. Somewhere around Springfield, we stopped for gas, and Priya climbed out of her truck, stretching her back, complaining loudly about a rattle in her dashboard, and the three of us stood in the fluorescent glow of the gas station for a few minutes eating stale sandwiches from the cooler, and Priya, who had known Sam since college, looked at me over the hood of her truck and said, without any real preamble, he talked about this trip for a month, like it was a punishment. 2,000 miles alone with his thoughts, he kept saying. You've been in the truck 4 hours, and he hasn't stopped smiling since Springfield city limits. I felt heat rush up my neck, and Sam, tending very hard to be absorbed in the gas pump, said, "I smile normally, Priya," in a tone that convinced absolutely no one, and Priya just raised her eyebrows at me like "see what I mean," and went back to her truck laughing. I held on to that small, ordinary moment for the rest of the drive, not because it meant anything definite yet, but because it was the first time in years that someone's happiness around me hadn't come with a hidden invoice. Nobody was going to ask me later what I'd done to earn that smile, or take it back if I did something wrong. It could just exist. I sat with that thought turning over in my chest for another 50 miles, watching cornfields blur past, feeling something in me that had been clenched for a very long time loosen by another careful degree. We stopped that night outside Indianapolis, 2 rooms at a roadside motel, Priya in one, Sam and I each getting our own, and I remember lying on top of the scratchy comforter fully dressed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like a rabbit. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my phone was silent. Derek didn't know where I was. Nobody was going to text me 11 times asking why I hadn't answered. The silence should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt like the first full breath I'd taken in a year. That was the night I heard him for the first time. Not Sam, Derek, the antagonist's true voice, though not in person. I'd forgotten to log out of a shared photo album on my old tablet, the one I'd left charging in my glove box out of habit, and a notification popped up. A voice memo Derek had left himself, mistakenly synced to the shared album from some drunk night months earlier that I'd never seen before. Curiosity, or maybe some masochistic need to confirm what I already knew, made me play it. His voice, slurred slightly, talking to someone I couldn't identify, laughing. "She's easy, man. That's the thing nobody gets. You just gotta be consistent. Women like her, they don't need you to be nice. They need you to be predictable. She thinks if she just does everything right, I'll stop being upset. She'll do that forever if I let her. A pause, more laughter, someone else's voice, muffled, then Derek again, lighter, almost fond, the way you'd talk about a pet you were proud of training. Honestly, I got lucky. She's exactly the kind of girl who thinks this is what love is supposed to feel like. I sat on that motel bed with the tablet in my lap and my whole body went cold and then strangely calm. Not the calm of peace, the calm of a decision finally, completely made. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window and watched the parking lot lights buzz, and somewhere around 3 a.m. there was a soft knock, and it was Sam, holding 2 coffees from a machine down the hall, saying he'd seen my light on and figured I might want company or might want to be left alone, and he'd brought coffee either way so I could choose. I let him in. I played him the recording. I watched his face while he listened, watched the muscle in his jaw jump, watched his hand tighten so hard around the paper coffee cup that it crumpled slightly at the seam. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it," he said when it ended, setting the cup down very carefully, like he didn't trust his own grip anymore. "That man does not get to decide what love is supposed to feel like for you. Not anymore. You hear me?" "I know," I whispered. And I did know in the part of my brain that could still think clearly. The rest of me was still catching up. For those 4 days between the motel room and the rest stop, I existed in a strange, suspended state, like a held breath that wouldn't release. I kept replaying the recording in my head, even without playing it again, Derek's voice looping in the back of my skull at odd moments. While I was brushing my teeth at a gas station bathroom sink, while I was half asleep against the truck window, watching Iowa turn into Nebraska. She's easy. She thinks this is what love is supposed to feel like. I kept trying to locate the exact moment I had started believing that, started mistaking control for care, started thinking that flinching was just what devotion felt like from the inside. I couldn't find one single moment. It had been 1,000 small moments, stacked so gradually I'd never felt the floor tilting beneath me. "You've gone quiet," Sam said somewhere around Lincoln, not looking away from the road, giving me the same permission to speak or not speak that he always gave me. "I keep trying to figure out how I didn't see it," I said. "Not just the recording. All of it. 3 years. I have a job where I catch other people's lies for a living, Sam. I read contracts for exactly this kind of trap sentence, and I couldn't see it in my own life." "That's not how it works," he said, quiet but certain. "People like that don't hand you the whole picture at once. They give it to you one small piece at a time. So small you talk yourself out of noticing, because noticing would mean admitting something you're not ready to admit yet. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's just what it costs to survive something like that while you're still inside it." I turned that over for the rest of the drive into Nebraska, and by the time we pulled into the rest stop outside North Platte, something in me had shifted from shame into something closer to clarity, and clarity, it turned out, was exactly what I needed to make the phone call I'd been avoiding for 400 miles. The confrontation itself happened right there, on the phone, in that same rest stop outside North Platte, Nebraska, with Sam standing 20 feet away pretending to check the trailer straps so I could have privacy, though I could see him glancing over every few seconds, like he was ready to close that distance in a second if he needed to. Derek had been calling, of course, dozens of times by then, and I'd finally answered, my finger hovering over the screen for a full minute before I pressed accept. "Where the hell are you?" he said immediately. No hello, voice tight in a way I recognized as the calm before something worse. "Your cousin says you never showed up. I've called the police, Mara. Do you understand how insane this is? Do you have any idea?" "I heard the recording," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "The one where you told your friend I'm easy because I just need you to be predictable. The one where you said I'm exactly the kind of girl who thinks this is what love feels like." There was a silence on the line, the kind of silence I used to find terrifying, and I felt my old instincts rise up, the urge to fill it, to apologize for bringing it up, to smooth it over before it became a punishment. I didn't. I let it sit there between us like a held breath. "That was a joke," he finally said. "You're taking a joke out of context because you're clearly having some kind of episode, running off with God knows who." And instead of coming home and talking like an adult, I'm not coming home, I said. I'm not doing this anymore. Any of it. You'll regret this, he said, and his voice had gone thin now, brittle, the mask slipping in real time. Nobody is ever going to want you the way I did. You think some stranger driving a U-Haul is going to put up with you? Do you think anyone's going to put in the work I put in? The work, I repeated. And something in me that had been coiled tight for 3 years finally uncoiled all at once. You mean the work of making me afraid to iron a shirt wrong? That work? I hung up before he could answer. My hands were shaking so hard, I nearly dropped the phone in the gravel. And I stood there in the wind with tears streaming down my face, not from grief, from something closer to release, and Sam was there within 5 steps, not touching me, just standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, saying nothing, letting me shake it out until I was ready to breathe normally again. I'm proud of you, he finally said, quiet, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it. That took more guts than most people have in them their whole lives. He's not going to let this go, I said, wiping my face. You don't know him. This isn't over just because I hung up the phone. I was right, though it would take 12 more days for that truth to fully arrive. We finished the drive. Eugene, then a smaller town 40 minutes outside it called Willowbrook, a main street with exactly 1 stoplight and a shop with dusty windows that Sam's cousin had been letting sit empty for 2 years, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. We unloaded the trucks together, Priya laughing at how bad Sam and I were at lifting in sync, and somewhere in the middle of hauling a roll-top desk through a doorway too narrow for it, both of us laughing so hard we nearly dropped it. I realized I hadn't thought about Derek in almost 4 hours, and the realization itself made my chest ache with something like grief for the version of me who'd never had that kind of freedom before. Those first nights in Willowbrook, I slept on a cot in the back room of the shop, because I hadn't figured out yet where I was actually going to live, and I remember lying there in the sawdust-smelling dark listening to the unfamiliar sound of a town with no traffic, no upstairs neighbor, no engagement ring-catching streetlight on the nightstand, and feeling a strange, disorienting kind of grief mixed in with the relief. Grief for the years I'd spent building a life I now had to unbuild piece by piece. Grief for the version of myself who might have left sooner if she'd known this kind of quiet was possible. Sam's cousin, a weathered, kind woman named Ruth who owned half the buildings on Main Street, took one look at me on my second morning there, hollow-eyed and jumping at the bell over the shop door, and without asking a single question, handed me a key to the little studio apartment above the hardware store 2 doors down. Rent's cheap and the radiator's loud, but it works, she said. You look like a person who could use a door that locks from the inside and nobody else is key to it. I didn't tell her anything about Derek. I don't think I needed to. Some women just recognize the shape of that particular exhaustion on sight. I called the firm in Dayton from that studio apartment, phone shaking slightly in my hand, and told them I needed the 2 personal days extended into a full week. Then, 4 days later, I called again and asked for 2 weeks. My supervisor, a brisk woman named Carol, who I'd always assumed barely knew my name, asked quietly if everything was all right, and something about the gentleness in her voice cracked something open in me, and I found myself telling her more than I meant to, sitting on the edge of a borrowed bed in a town I'd never heard of 3 weeks earlier. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Take the time you need. That job will still be here. Whatever this is, it sounds like it matters more." Priya stayed in Willowbrook for the first week, helping set up the shop before heading back to her own life in Portland. And on her last night, there the 3 of us sat on overturned crates in the half-organized storeroom eating takeout out of paper cartons, and she looked at me with an unexpected seriousness and said, "For what it's worth, I've watched Sam date exactly 2 people in the 8 years I've known him, and both times he shrank a little, tried to be smaller and easier, so it wouldn't fall apart. He hasn't done that once this whole trip. I don't know what happened to you before this, and you don't have to tell me, but whatever it was, I'm glad you're both out here instead of still in it." I didn't have words for how much that meant, so I just nodded, throat too tight to speak, and Sam reached over under the table and squeezed my hand once, briefly, like he understood exactly what the silence was holding. The job was supposed to be 2 weeks. I stayed 3. Then I told the firm in Dayton I needed a leave of absence. Then I told them I needed longer than that. And somewhere in there I stopped calling it a leave of absence at all, even to myself. Sam and I built something slowly, deliberately, the way you'd restore something valuable and fragile, which I suppose was fitting, given his hands. We didn't rush it. I remember the night about 5 weeks in, sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside the shop, the sky doing that impossible orange-purple thing it does over the Cascades, when he finally reached over and took my hand, tentative, like he expected me to pull away. "I don't want to make this messy," he said. "You just got out of something that took a lot from you. I don't want to be the thing that makes you doubt whether you left for the right reasons, or the thing you run to instead of the thing you choose, so I'm not going to rush this. I just wanted you to know I'm not going anywhere whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready." "I know what I want," I said, though my voice shook. "I'm just scared of wanting it too fast and getting it wrong again." "Then we'll go slow," he said simply. "We've got time." We did go slow. We worked side by side in the shop, sanding old wood back to its grain, and some days the only thing between us was comfortable silence, exactly the kind the job posting had asked for, and I found I didn't mind it at all. I loved it, actually. The way silence with him felt like rest instead of danger. There was a night, maybe 10 days after the tailgate conversation, when he taught me how to strip old varnish off a chair leg, standing close behind me to correct my grip on the tool, and I felt his breath catch slightly when his hand covered mine, and neither of us moved for a second longer than the lesson required. Neither of us mentioned it. That was the rhythm we found, small, honest inches, never demanded, never withheld. There was the first time he cooked for me, a clumsy attempt at his grandmother's pot roast that came out slightly burnt on one side. And when I laughed at it, he didn't go quiet the way Derek would have, didn't set his fork down with that particular controlled precision that used to make my stomach drop. He just laughed too, harder than me, and said, in my defense, "She never wrote down the recipe. I've been reverse engineering it from memory for 6 years." And I realized, sitting at his little kitchen table eating slightly burnt pot roast, that I had not once during that meal calculated what I might owe him for it. There was the night I had a nightmare about the ironing board, woke up gasping in the little apartment above the shop that I'd started renting from his cousin, and texted him at 2 in the morning, not really expecting a reply, and he called me back within 90 seconds, voice thick with sleep, saying, "I'm here. I'm awake. Tell me what you need," and stayed on the phone with me for 40 minutes, until my breathing evened out, and never once, not that night or any night after, made me feel like a burden for needing it. Slowly, the calculations I'd trained myself to run, what will this cost me? What will I owe for this kindness? What's the price of asking for what I want? Began to go quiet. Not silent. Old fears don't disappear that cleanly, but quiet enough that I could hear other things underneath them. Hope, mostly. A stubborn, persistent hope that kept insisting this might actually be different, and that I might actually be allowed to have it. But Derek didn't stop. About 7 weeks after I left, a letter arrived at the shop, addressed to me, though I'd told no one there my new address except Sam. Inside was a printed photograph of the two of us, me and Derek from a happier year, at his sister's wedding, with a note in his handwriting, "You'll come back. You always do. Everyone eventually sees you the way I do." I stood in the back room holding it, feeling the old fear crawl up my spine, the specific, just fear of a person who has learned exactly how much damage this particular man is capable of. Then came the calls to Priya, fishing for information under a fake name. Then a car, parked across the street from the shop for 2 full days, that I recognized before I let myself admit I recognized it. Sam saw my face change when I looked out the window and followed my gaze, and his whole body went rigid. "Is that him?" he said, already moving toward the door. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm, my heart slamming. "Don't give him a reason. That's what he wants, an excuse, a story where he's the victim, and I'm the crazy one, and you're the violent stranger who attacked him. Please, let me handle it the smart way." That same week, My phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, a Dayton area code, and against my better judgment I answered. It was my old coworker, Beth, the one who'd once seen the bruise on my wrist and accepted my filing cabinet excuse without argument. Her voice was tight, apologetic. "He came by the office," she said. "Asked a bunch of questions about whether anyone had your new address. Said he was worried about you. Said you weren't answering his calls because you were, and I'm quoting him, having some kind of breakdown. I didn't tell him anything, Mara. I want you to know that. But I thought you should know he's still looking." I sat on the back step of the shop after that call for a long time, knees pulled to my chest, feeling the old fear crawl back into my body like it had never left, like the 3,000 miles between us had been an illusion the whole time. Sam found me there, sat down without a word, and I finally said, "I don't think I'll ever actually be far enough away from him. I think some part of me is always going to be checking the parking lot." "Maybe," Sam said quietly, which surprised me, because I'd expected reassurance, not honesty. "I can't promise you that feeling goes away completely, but I can promise you won't be checking that parking lot alone anymore." He didn't reach for my hand, didn't try to fix it with a hug. He just sat there, steady, present, letting the fear exist in the space between us without trying to talk me out of it, and somehow that did more than any promise could have. The smart way took 2 more weeks. I found a lawyer in Eugene, a sharp, tired woman named Renata Cho, who specialized in exactly this kind of thing, and together we built a file. The voice memo, the letter, the photos of the car, a timeline of the 11-minute texts pulled from my old phone records, a statement from a coworker back in Dayton who'd noticed bruises on my wrist once that I'd explained away as a filing cabinet accident, and who, when I finally called her, admitted she'd never believed that explanation for a second. The night everything broke into the open, Derek showed up at the shop directly, no letter, no parked car at a careful distance, just him, standing in the doorway at closing time with a face I'd once thought I loved and now could barely look at. "We need to talk," he said. "Alone. Anything you want to say, you can say in front of Sam," I said, and I felt my own voice hold steady, and some old, wounded part of me marveled at that steadiness like it belonged to a stranger. "This is between us," Derek said, taking a step closer, and Sam moved, not aggressively, just enough to put himself half a step nearer to me, a wall of quiet presence rather than threat. "There is no us," I said. "There hasn't been an us since I heard that recording, Derek. You told your friend I was easy to control. You told him I thought that was what love was supposed to feel like. Do you know how long it took me to believe you were wrong about that?" His jaw worked. For 1 second, just one, something like real fear flickered across his face, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that he had never once imagined I'd be the one to leave. "I made a mistake. I was drunk. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," I said. "And I have it recorded. And I have the letters. And I have a lawyer. And if you come near this shop or this town again, all of that goes to the police and to your employer, who I understand has a very strict harassment policy." I hadn't planned to say that last part, but it landed, and I watched him understand in real time that he had lost. "You're going to regret this," Derek said, backing toward the door, but the certainty was gone from his voice now, replaced by something thinner, something almost pleading. "Nobody's ever going to understand you the way I did. You're going to get tired of him being nice to you. People like you always do. You need someone who actually pays attention. Paying attention isn't the same as controlling every part of me," I said, and my voice didn't shake, and I felt, for the first time in that entire relationship, taller than him, though he had 4 inches on me and always had. "You never once paid attention to what I needed. You paid attention to what you could take away from me if I stepped out of line. That's not the same thing, Derek. It never was." He looked at Sam then, one last attempt, like he thought there might be some solidarity between them, some unspoken male understanding he could appeal to. "You don't know her like I do," he said. "You don't know what you're signing up for." Sam didn't raise his voice. He didn't move any closer than he already had. He just said evenly, "I know exactly what I'm signing up for. I'm signing up for a woman brave enough to leave everything she knew, rather than spend one more year being small for somebody. I think I got the better end of that deal a long time before you ever showed up on this street. Something in Derek's face collapsed at that, some final scaffolding giving way, and he turned and walked out without another word, the bell over the door jangling behind him with an absurd, cheerful little sound that didn't match the moment at all. He left. He didn't come back. 6 months later, Renata called to tell me the restraining order had been finalized without contest, that Derek had moved to Charlotte for a fresh start. And I hung up the phone and sat on the shop floor and cried for almost 20 minutes, not out of fear this time, out of the strange grief of finally, fully closing a door I'd been holding open with my own body for years. Sam found me there, sanding dust still on his hands, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat down on the floor next to me, shoulder to shoulder, and waited until I was ready to talk, exactly the way he had in that Indianapolis motel room all those months before. "It's really over," I finally said. "It's really over," he agreed. Then gently, "Does that mean you're ready to stop going slow?" I laughed, wet and startled, and turned to look at him, at the sawdust on his forearms, the crooked smile, the steadiness that had never once wavered even when I gave him every reason to walk away. "I think I've been ready for a while," I admitted. I was just scared of what it meant to want something and not be punished for it. "Nobody's going to punish you here," he said, and he said it like a promise, and I believed him fully, for the first time in my adult life, believing a promise like that without some small locked room in my chest waiting for the catch. I want to jump forward now, because I promised you the truth, not just the wreckage, and the truth is that healing isn't a single dramatic scene. It's 1,000 small ordinary ones stacked on top of each other until one day you look up and realize you're standing somewhere entirely new. 3 years passed, and I want to tell you honestly that healing wasn't a straight line, because I think it does a disservice to pretend it was. There were still nights that first year when a car with the wrong headlights would pull up outside the shop, and my whole body would go rigid before my brain caught up and told me it was just a customer, just a delivery, just an ordinary stranger with nothing to do with me at all. There were mornings I still woke up bracing for a silence that never came, and had to remind myself, standing at my own kitchen counter with my own coffee, that nobody was rationing, that I was allowed to just be at peace. Sam never once made me feel foolish for those moments. He'd just say, "Still here," quietly, from wherever he was in the room, like a small anchor thrown across the distance, and eventually the mornings of bracing became fewer, and then they became rare. And then, one ordinary Tuesday about 2 years in, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had one at all. The shop in Willowbrook became something real, something people drove from Portland to visit. Sam's restored pieces written up in a regional magazine with his grandfather's old roll-top desk on the cover. I finished my paralegal certification transfer and started working with Renata's firm, helping other people build the kind of files I'd once had to build for myself. And there was something fiercely satisfying about that, about turning the worst thing that had happened to me into a skill that helped other people escape their own versions of it. Sam and I got married on a Tuesday in late October, small, just Priya and Renata and my cousin from Columbus, and a handful of townspeople who'd become something like family at the same rest stop outside North Platte, where I'd hung up the phone on Derek for the last time. Sam's idea, not mine, though when he suggested it, driving 12 hours out of the way just to say vows in a gravel lot with a Cascade sunset nowhere in sight, I understood exactly why it had to be there. It was the place where I'd first stood in the wind and shaken, and been proud of myself instead of afraid. We stood on that same patch of gravel, older now, steadier, his hands rough with a decade more of sawdust, mine no longer flinching at silence. And when it came time for vows, he pulled a small folded paper from his jacket pocket, and his voice shook, actually shook, this steady, unshakable man, and he said, "I told you once that I chose you because no one else applied. And I need you to know that was the luckiest sentence I ever said out loud, because it turned out the job I was really hiring for was somebody to spend the rest of my life with. And it turns out you were the only qualified applicant the whole time." I laughed and cried at the same time, the two things so tangled together by then I could barely tell them apart, and I said my own vows back to him, about silence that finally felt like rest instead of danger, about a door that opened onto a highway instead of closing on a kitchen, about a love that never once asked me to be predictable, only to be honest. Priya cried through the entire ceremony, loudly, unapologetically, dabbing at her face with a gas station napkin, because nobody had thought to bring tissues to a rest-stop wedding, and Renata stood beside her in a blazer that was slightly too formal for gravel and wind, holding a bouquet of grocery store daisies we'd bought that morning because there hadn't been a florist for 80 miles. My cousin from Columbus filmed the whole thing on her phone, and Ruth, who'd driven the 12 hours out just for this, kept saying under her breath, I always knew the second I handed her that key, until Sam's cousin next to her finally laughed and told her to hush and let the vows happen. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at that small, strange, perfect gathering of people who had each, in their own quiet way, helped hand me back my own life. And I thought about Donna at the diner, who wasn't there but whom I'd sent a photo of the pie case for old time's sake. And I thought about the version of myself who used to iron shirts at 6 in the morning with her stomach in knots. And I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as arrival, like I had finally finished the drive I'd started that gray Ohio morning. You told me once you chose me because no one else applied, I said to Sam, my own paper trembling slightly in the wind. I used to think that was the least romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. Now I think it might be the most honest, and honest turned out to be exactly what I needed. You never once asked me to be predictable, you just asked me to be here. And somehow that was enough to make me want to stay for the rest of my life. We drove back to Willowbrook that night as husband and wife, the desert stars enormous over Nebraska, then Wyoming, then home, and somewhere around mile 400, half asleep against the window, I remembered the exact moment I'd first read that classifieds ad in a parking garage, hiding from my own life on a lunch break, and I thought about how strange it was that the smallest, most desperate decisions are so often the ones that end up saving you. I thought, too, about how easy it would have been to never click that ad at all, to let it sit unread in a saved tab the way so many almost decisions do, quietly dying of neglect. I thought about how many women I now sat across a desk from, in my work with Renata, who were still standing exactly where I'd been standing in that parking garage, phone in hand, too afraid to send the first message. I couldn't fix that for all of them. But I could tell them, when they asked, that sometimes the door out looks like nothing more than a stranger's classifieds post about a truck full of furniture, and that it is always, always worth finding out. So here's what I want to ask you, because I think you might understand this better than anyone else could. Have you ever made a small, quiet, terrified decision that ended up changing the entire shape of your life? And looking back, could you even explain to someone why you did it in that exact moment? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, because I think we don't tell each other enough about the quiet moments that saved us. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.